Law is a fundamentally important thing in the world. People need laws so that there is a mechanism for resolving disputes when bad things happen, when bad people do bad things, and so that people are accountable for their actions. Generally, I find that those who say they don't want law are those who don't want to be accountable for their actions, aka tyrants. Unfortunately, people in the cryptocurrency space, the space outside of, well, our traditional financial system, we might think. Those who lead quote unquote decentralized projects, such as BTC, believe that their systems transcend law and that their systems, by virtue of being decentralized, are beyond the control of any one government. Thus, they make an excuse for all of the financial crimes, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and other illegal activity that happens on their network. However, this is born out of a misunderstanding about how blockchain systems actually work. This is born out of a misunderstanding about the nature of law, and the longer technocrats can continue to perpetuate these misunderstandings, the more violations of law can occur on these networks. And so those who seek to violate the law benefit when policymakers and people who otherwise engage in the political process fail to understand how these systems actually work. I want to comply with law, and I believe that blockchain technology fundamentally is legally compliant and can be made to comply with law. When I say law, I mean, of course, laws that are in the Western world, in the United States, the country where I live. Laws that say, for example, that when a criminal steals money, that money is subject to, well, it would be the proceeds of crime. And that money does not rightfully belong to the criminal. So, if a government agency is attacked by ransomware and the hackers demand payment in Bitcoin, the government agency might pay the Bitcoin to the attackers, and then they think that there's no way to get that Bitcoin back, and the attackers make off with the Bitcoin, and maybe, if we're lucky, the attackers give the government agency back control over their computer systems. We can think of that as an example. What happens in this case? I mean, what is the actual mechanism by which these criminals make off with these proceeds of crime? What would happen in the traditional banking system, the traditional financial system, if something like this were to happen? Imagine if somebody extorted you and said, make check payable to, right? Pay to the order of so-and-so company. you would write your check, or, well, if you're going to pay the ransom, you might write your check. And then you would send it through the banking system, and they would get their money, except it's proceeds of crime. So you could then report it to the police, and the police would issue an order to the bank, who would then seize the money as proceeds of crime. And that's why most times in the physical world, those kind of things happen one way or another with cash, right? A lot of illicit transactions happen with cash because, well, it's a little bit harder to stop, someone who is in a, when they have a briefcase full of cash versus stopping a bank transaction. Generally, unless the bank itself is corrupt, they're going to be subject to sanctions, and they're going to be brought into compliance, especially if they're using US dollars, especially if they're domestic in the United States. Point is, banks are subject to law, and when proceeds of crime are sent into a bank account controlled by a domestic US bank, then that bank must seize that money when presented with a valid and lawful order to do so, and must freeze it. And then, that money becomes subject to whatever lawful orders are issued by our legal system, by our courts. So in cryptocurrency world, with these ransoms and this ransomware, when these hackers say, pay this ransom to this Bitcoin address or to this key, right? They're telling you to use the Bitcoin ledger to register a transaction, transferring what they call ownership and what I call custody over these Bitcoins to their key, so that they might further transfer it and gain, right? They gain, well, the benefits of ownership over it. They seek to have everyone believe that they own these coins, because then they have beneficial ownership. They can then sell the coins, give them to somebody else, get something in return, right? They get beneficial ownership. That's what they want. And this key, this address, this code, right? This string of letters and numbers, all the experts, who I believe are mostly misled or misleading, as the case may be, will tell you that this long string of letters and numbers means that we can't take these coins away from these criminals because it's a key, and it's really a lock, and then only the key held by the criminal can unlock that lock and get those coins back. But when you get locked out of your house, you call a locksmith. And they can kind of have a way of, they don't say, well, you lost the key to your house, therefore you don't own your house, right? The rules of the Bitcoin network, according to these criminals, would be anybody with the key owns these Bitcoins or these cryptocurrency assets, and whoever has the keys has the right to transfer these assets. However, if I find a car key or even take it from somebody, do I gain ownership over that car? Can I rightfully claim that car as my own? If we go back to the first legal systems ever, I wonder when the lock was first invented, those experts who said that, well, we have this device and whoever has the key can open the lock. I think the key represents the ability to access and use something. Custody. But a key never represents ownership. Never represents legally recognized title. And technologists have never been able to say with any authority, recognized authority, legitimate authority, that because of this mechanism of locking and unlocking value, the legal code is invalid. The argument that experts in the cryptocurrency world will fall back on is, well, the rules of our system are set up such that only the person who has the key can access these blockchain-backed assets. Think about that. The rules of our system are set up such that only the person who has the key can access the assets. Humans made rules and then agreed to follow those rules and wrote computer code which created a network of computers which follow those rules. Imagine if I started a bank and I said, anybody who has an account at this bank, right? Instead of saying the account is linked to you as a person, your name, I linked the account to just a sequence of 4 numbers. Anybody who knows those 4 numbers gets to transfer assets around this bank, or even to other banks or to other people. So those are the rules of my bank, and I'm going to enforce those rules, and we've all just agreed to force everyone to follow these rules. So when I go to that bank and I say, here are my numbers, I can then transfer my assets around. And when a criminal goes to that bank and they also use my numbers, well, that criminal, according to my rules, has just the same right to transfer my assets around. Well, they're not my assets. The assets you see according to those rules belong to the knower of those numbers. But that undermines the concept of property and ownership that has existed throughout all of human civilization. Humans own things. Numbers don't own things. When I have my savings, and when a criminal uses my 4 numbers to transfer them, is it right that I lose my savings in this bank? Should we ask ourselves whether maybe these rules are in need of being revised? Because that's what's happening on the blockchain. The rules of these cryptocurrencies, such as BTC, and other coins that seek to, if not openly violate the law, they seek to create systems that are not conducive to legal compliance. If those are the rules of these systems, people need to figure out whether that's acceptable. Would you go to a bank where those are the rules? Or would you ask the people who set up that kind of a bank if maybe in the case of a flagrant violation of the rules, maybe by a criminal, if we could maybe give that person their life savings back and not acknowledge the criminal as the rightful owner of those funds. Maybe when that government agency had a bunch of data stolen and then a bunch of public money stolen by a ransomware attack, maybe not acknowledge the criminal as the rightful owner of those funds. It's about the rules in place and the people that agree to follow those rules and to enforce those rules. People on the network create and enforce rules. And that applies to everybody that operates on that network. And when you have a network where there are many people, they need to agree on the rules. And so it brings up the question, right? In Bitcoin, the myth is there is no one central controller of the network. And that's right. In the international banking system, there is no one single central actor. There are many banks, some central banks of some countries. But at the end of the day, what it comes down to is people either choose to transact or they don't. Pressure gets applied, sanctions get applied. Big people pressure little people. And the system does what it's going to do. It's distributed at an international level. And then in Bitcoin, who are the banks? Who are the ones that facilitate the operation of the network? Who are the ones that enforce the rules? The last sentence of the Bitcoin white paper says, any needed rules and incentives can be enforced with this consensus mechanism, talking about the consensus mechanism relating to the creation of Bitcoin blocks by miners. There is not one single central miner, and no miner makes the rules, but every miner has the ability to say, these are the rules that I am operating under. And if you do not accept my rules, I will not be on the same network as you because you have gone against the rules that I am operating under. Banks in the United States must operate under the rules that are applicable to banks in the United States. And if one of them doesn't, they are subject to, of course, law, right? They're subject to enforcement actions. They're subject to seizures of their physical and electronic assets. And they will be brought into compliance with the law. Miners in Bitcoin who facilitate the processing of transactions, who accept or reject blocks, and who express their acceptance of blocks by building on top of them, can be brought into compliance with the rules demanded by law. This means that if we all decide, if the courts decide in the United States that people are going to not acknowledge the legitimacy of criminals who claim ownership of certain digital assets, that's valid. Miners in the United States will follow the court's order. If they do not, they will be subject to, well, contempt of court proceedings, I would imagine. So as time goes on, we have to ask ourselves as a society, what is acceptable? What is acceptable for people to run around saying about legal compliance and Bitcoin? And what is the reality going to be for those who choose to enforce certain rules that are not in line with what law recognizes? Laws do not recognize a number as a type of person who is capable of owning, and I say person in the legal sense, capable of owning assets. Laws recognize natural persons, corporations, partnerships, trusts, things of that nature. Things that society recognizes as, well, useful ways of denoting ownership, structures for denoting ownership. And within the Bitcoin system, there are ways of reassigning. When we think about how it actually works at a fundamental level, we have a blockchain. One common statement made by criminals is that it is not possible to change previous blocks in the blockchain, and therefore it is not possible to unwind transactions. However, in the field of accounting, we have the concept of a ledger. If I make a transaction on a ledger that is an error, or otherwise a transaction that needs to be unwound, I do not go and cross out or change the existing entry in the ledger. When the mistake is discovered, I create a new transaction denoting the mistake and constituting, according to the rules recognized by the system in which I operate, constituting, and rightfully so, an unwinding of the previous transaction. So if I accidentally transfer $10,000 then I could make a transaction that says, well, negative 10,000, right? Between two accounts to effectuate the annulment of such a transfer. When I create that kind of an entry, I make it so that, well, yes, the mistake happened. But then I realized it was a mistake. Then society realized that the criminal does not rightfully own this property. Then it was seized. And yes, that's part of the rules. And now it's being assigned to the courts so that the courts can then assign it to the rightful owner. And I would say that any system, any blockchain system that is not compatible with effectuating the legal process, the process of transferring ownership of these assets by appending a new transaction which says that due to legal reasons, here is a case number, here is a valid link to a PDF file signed by a judge, a court order. This transaction is unwound. Due to these reasons, we're making an entry in the ledger, the distributed ledger. We're not going and changing the old one. Yes, the transaction still happened. We don't have to go back and change it, but we say that now this is the current state. And any blockchain that refuses to acknowledge law as part of its architecture and as part of the way that it was designed, by the way, Bitcoin, BTC, as well as other blockchains, they are designed to be compatible with law. People try to change it. People try to make it so that it's not compatible, but it is. Why? How do I know this? Well, blockchains are public. All the money exchanged on Silk Road between parties engaging in illegal activity was publicly announced. The Bitcoin white paper mentions this. Transactions must be publicly announced. So there's no ambiguity about who has what. There's no ambiguity about the nature of the blockchain and where the assets are. Everybody recognizes where the assets are. Everybody can see the transactions. That's the nature of the blockchain. And so everybody can recognize the capacity for courts to order the Bitcoin miners to comply with recognizing the legitimacy of transactions that seize certain blockchain assets and then later transfer them to another place. Under law. Not because I have the key, not because we want people to recognize that the key is the end all and be all. It's not. That's not how ownership works. because we recognize as a society that humans are sometimes stupid and we misplace keys and don't have them, or because criminals steal things and force us to give up keys, and that's wrong. And that's why we need law in Bitcoin. And people don't understand this because it's a new technology. The internet was once a new technology. Banking itself was once a new technology. And it took a while for people to create the necessary laws and regulations to effectuate the transfer of property from one owner to the next via a legal process, to prevent Mr. Ponzi from running a Ponzi scheme, and to otherwise regulate the financial system so that criminals can't do as much crime. And when anyone says the blockchain is not subject to law, or that it's anonymous, or that the government will not be able to control it, they will. Because that's how law works. As humanity recognizes the necessity that certain things ought be so, law allows for us to compel the world until they are so. And in this case, it is the Bitcoin miners who enforce the rules, and it is the Bitcoin miners who will be subject to law. And the people who create the software that the Bitcoin miners use to facilitate their operations, those people are also subject to law as anyone else in the world. They are people. They are people just like anyone else. Just because they write software does not mean they are above the law. And that's how law works in Bitcoin. That's how law works in general. So there is one thing that Bitcoin does do that I did mention earlier, and it is the public announcement of transactions. It means that when someone makes a transaction in Bitcoin, they announce it, they broadcast it out to all the Bitcoin miners, and people can listen to that network. They can audit that network. The public can see and have a view into what's on that network. That means that there's accountability. That's powerful. People can recognize what's happening. And when people can recognize that, they can hold people accountable. Sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants. Electric light, the most efficient policeman. Anyone who knows where that quote came from can appreciate the value that Bitcoin provides as a mechanism for transparency and public accountability, so that when laws are enforced, the enforcement actions themselves are registered as updates to the public ledger. But the enforcement actions are recognized by the public as being valid. That is powerful, because it means that the rules are known ahead of time, that we are all subject to the rules, and that when those rules are enforced, the enforcement actions are known by the parties who participate in the network. But the enforcement actions themselves are valid, and courts can order miners to enforce the rules. Courts can order the people who create the software used by Bitcoin miners to update their software and bring it into compliance with law. And when that happens, you make the criminals really scared. Because now they don't get to use the fact that this is a new and poorly understood technology as a mechanism for crime. And all of those previous actions they have taken, all of those crimes they have committed by publicly announcing them via transactions on the blockchain, those crimes can be looked at over time, perhaps. Because when you create a transaction on Bitcoin, whether it's legal or not, you publicly announce it to the world. This is what you've done, and that leaves an audit trail. That leaves a record. And that's why Bitcoin is one of the worst systems for doing illegal shit compared to other systems. So, I hope I've been able to clarify some of the misconceptions that are out there about how the law applies to digital currencies. And I hope that in recognizing the validity of law, people can better come to understand their role in shaping the law and engaging in civil discourse, doing your part to build things and interact. Let the world know what you think the law should be through civil discourse. So that's an introduction to law a little bit. I'm no person to give a course on law. Many others more qualified than I, but I do know my fair share about Bitcoin, and I think it's certainly subject to law, and it was designed that way. I do believe that. So that's all I have for this one. I hope that this has been informative. And for anybody out there who has questions about this, who wants to speak privately, you may reach me through email. You may email me at ty@projectbabbage.com. That's ty@projectbabbage.com. And I hope you check out some of the other videos on this channel if you are a developer interested in building things on top of Bitcoin in a lawful way. Because Bitcoin will not treat you kindly if you are a criminal. So, thank you for watching. Bye-bye now.